Thank you. I am Lorenzo Busatti from Italy, so you will understand some of my mistakes about pronunciation in your language. But by the way, I'm doing networking since 1997 and blah, 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 blah. You can read this in the slides. I am a trainer, and I just delivered an IPv6 training classes in Austin the previous 2 days, and I had 9 students that have this training, and they enjoy that. I live in Italy, and I'm used to present something into the MAMS. I start in 2011 to deliver something, and this is a little history about my presentations and the topics. I am also the founder of the Routing and Wireless Academy, and most important, the Riga Bootcamp. I don't know if you know that, but it is 1 week of training that we are used to deliver twice for years in Riga. In 1 week, we use it to deliver 2 training classes, and it's amazing experience because we live together with the lunches, the dinner, and even good city tour in the midday, and the free day in the middle, and with the networking games with prizes. And it's a very nice experience, and we have a lot of US subscribers this year for this summer. This is for June. Okay, finish the advertising time. What about my presentation? It's about the VLANs in RouterOS. RouterOS allows you to work with VLANs in different ways, by software, by the switch chip, and by the bridges. So we have today 3 main points, 3 main places where we can create VLANs. This presentation will try to cover the pros and the cons of these approaches and to show you some tips of using them. The VLANs seem to be simple to deploy, but can actually be very complex. Even simple operations can be tricky if you don't know where and how to put your hands. While delivering many training courses, I discovered that the VLANs are often used improperly. That's why I made this presentation. And I have also to tell you just a little story that is not a joke. 1 year ago, I think, I have a friend that when I'm making some consulting, and he said me, I tried to use one MikroTik switch for 10 gig interface, but I have to replace with another brand because was not able to deliver more than 4 gigabit. I say, why? Is it not possible? It can deliver at wire speed 10 gigabit, but which configuration did you made on that switch? Oh, just a VLAN. I say, okay. And where you created these VLANs? Oh, on interfaces, VLANs. So maybe you should know, or you can know, what happens, and that's why I am delivering that to you. The target of this presentation is to understand how you can make the VLANs in those 3 places and the differences between them. It's not a step-by-step tutorials about all the VLAN things. A virtual LAN or VLAN is any broadcast domain that is partitioned and isolated at the data link layer, so OSI model layer 2. The protocol, the first edition, is from 2003, so it's not quite old way. The VLANs are just a header, a VLAN ID header, that is from 0 to 4095. Don't forget that the last one, the first one, and the second one should be used. So we have 4096 VLANs that we can create in any switch and router. And this is the VLAN tag that is just added into the layer 2 frames. That's why a VLAN is a VPN. It's a layer 2 VPN. Yes, it is without authentication, it is without encryption, but I'm used to say that it's free. It's a free VPN because it's not eating your layer 3 MTU. It's for free. In the VLANs world, we have the definitions of the port role, but they are not uniform as a standard, and usually any vendor uses his own terms. But the following ones are almost universally used by technicians, and as they are. We have the tagged port, where all the packets will be forwarded by the interface contain the VLAN informations. The untagged one, where the packets will be forwarded by the interface, are untagged, so without the VLAN tag. So it can be understood by devices that does not have VLAN setting up. The access port are belong to one VLAN, and the port will be untagged at the end. Then we have two different flavor. Hybrid port, where multiple VLANs can be untagged and tagged, and the trunk port. Trunk port is a weird, definition because it's used in different manner between vendors, and you can do something wrong maybe. Just read carefully the documentation before apply, but the trunk port usually just carry out multiple VLANs in one physical links. That's the theory part, it's just finished. The VLANs now in RouterOS, where we can create VLANs. These are the three main, yes, the projector is in a wrong position, but it's not my fault. I'm sorry for that. Today it's possible to manage the VLANs in RouterOS in three different main places. On the interfaces, on the bridge, and on the switch. And usually people are used to make a mess with the settings. Yes. It's very easy. It's not so hard, but if you don't know how to do that, you will do a mess. So they are managed in the same manner. They can be set up using the same commands. They have the same performance. No. Absolutely no. Let me show you the differences between them, and you will enjoy a lot the VLANs under RouterOS. First one, the software. The software VLANs, you can create them from the interfaces menu, and they are software VLANs. I mean that the traffic, all the traffic through this VLAN will affect and will be affected as a consequence by the CPU. So we'll use the CPU. But they are available on any RouterOS devices, even my small little friend, the world famous MapLite. Any RouterOS device can run the VLANs from the interfaces menu, but they are software. That is not a bad thing, but you have just to know that they will use the CPU, and that's all. That's why my friend, as I told you before, was able just to push 4 gigabit on a switch because he used a software VLAN on that switch. So was using all the CPU, and was a mistake. Then we have the hardware VLANs. The hardware VLANs are usually made under the switch menu. That one. The traffic will be managed by the switch chip at a wire speed, so at full speed of the interfaces. Yes, depending the switch type, and will not affect the CPU. For these VLANs, the CPU will not be used, but they are only available on RouterOS devices that have a switch chip inside. lot of routers, but not all, and the switches. All the CSR switches of MikroTik have the switch chip. And you can use it by RouterOS. And then, from last, we have the VLANs in the bridge. There, into the bridge. The VLANs managed by the bridge can be software or hardware. It depends. Depends from what? About the presence of the switch chip, if you have or not, and how it's configured. Your knowledge, by the consequence, will make if the CPU will be affected or not. It's up the hardware that you choose and about your configuration. So the VLANs in the bridge are very good things that I will show you, but can be hardware or software. Don't forget it. At the end, we have different places to manage them, and with different performance due to the evolution of RouterOS and MikroTik hardware devices in the last 10 years. That's why it's up to you to know the differences between them and to use properly. So let's talk about the first kind of VLANs, the software one. They exist from the beginning on RouterOS, at least from since version 2.30 something. You can create them from the interfaces VLAN menu. There. Interfaces, VLAN. And you can create as many you want. And they are 100% software. When you're creating one VLAN by software, you have just to choose the name of the interface, the VLAN ID that is there, VLAN ID, and in the layer 2 interface where to add the tag at the egress or check and remove it at ingress. These are very easy to set up and to deploy, and I think that you use a lot into the past. But if your layer 2 interface is into a bridge, I suggest you to use the bridge for tagging the interface. That should be the proper setting, is not the one in the screenshot. You have to select the bridge. And the service tag. The service tag is for using 802.1 AD compatible service tag, and it's very useful also. It's not the main scope, but we work with some vendors. For example, if you are trying to do the VLANs between MikroTik and HP, maybe they will not work at the beginning, but using the service tag, start to work like a magic. The software VLANs are useful to send some kind of traffic to the CPU to run a services on the VLAN, because it's a layer 2 interface. It is a virtual interface, but it's an interface, layer 2 at all effect. And you can run on top the HTTP client, the HTTP server, PPPoE client, PPPoE server, any layer 2 services that you want, and even layer 3, of course, IP addresses, and so on. At the end, with the software VLANs, you can tag and tag traffic from any layer 2 interface. If you want, you can create something that is similar like a switch using the bridge and bridging all the interfaces. Pros can be used on any device, with or without the switch chip inside, even on the CHRs. But the cons is that they will use the CPU for pushing the traffic. Then we have the hardware VLANs, 100% hardware one. They are into the switch chip. So if you have a switch chip on your router, on your device, you can create and manage them from the switch, port, VLAN, and rule. Those are the menu. port, VLANs, and rules. How to manage the hardware VLANs? For each switch port, this is the switch port settings. So for Ethernet port, you can set up the VLAN mode for ingress traffic. Be careful that it's an ingress traffic that can be set up into the VLAN mode that is there as disable, check, fallback, and secure. What they mean, disable will not check for the VLANs and is by default. Fallback, check for tagged traffic and forward all the untagged one. Check and secure are different but are similar from this aspect. They will check for tagged traffic and drop all the untagged traffic. But check on the wiki all the behavior that are under the settings. Then we have the VLAN header. The next one is just under the VLAN mode. The VLAN header is set the actions which is performed on the port for egress traffic. It's not ingress anymore, but is egress. As add if missing, that adds a VLAN tag on the egress traffic and it should be used for trunk ports. Always strip, that we remove the VLAN tag on the egress traffic, that should be used for the access port, and leave as is, that does not add or not remove a VLAN tag on the egress traffic, should be used for the hybrid port. And then we have the default VLAN ID. The default VLAN ID is the last settings, that one. We use these settings when the VLAN header is always strip, as I showed you before, we'll use that VLAN IP to replace. And for hybrid ports, to tag all the untagged traffic. Then we have the VLAN tab on the switch window. There, we can define the VLAN membership of the ports. In this example, the Ethernet 3 and Ethernet 4 are members of the VLAN 1. You can add, for each VLAN ID, you can add as interface, add many interfaces as you wish. Then the last settings is the rule tab. On the rule tab, on the switch window, you can create rules, match on which switch, VLAN header, VLAN ID, and you can do actions for making something happen. At the end, the hardware VLANs will use the switch chip. You can create almost any kind of port with the VLANs, useful to manage VLANs like in a switch, because it's a switch chip. Pro will not use the CPU. It's able to provide a wide speed, but the cons is available only on devices provided with a switch chip, and different functions depend on the chip model. You have to check on the routerbot.com all the specification before buying and applying the configs, because different models have different switch chip and can support VLAN or not, VLAN filtering or not, and so on. Be careful about the hardware choice. And the last one are the VLANs in the bridge, my favorite one. Since the version 6.41, RouterOS had major changes to the bridge configuration, and today the bridge must be used for setting up basic switching functions if your hardware have a switch chip. The main VLAN setting, because the topic of the presentation is about the VLAN, is VLAN filtering, which globally control the VLAN awareness and VLAN tag processing into the bridge. So while and when creating a bridge, I am on the bridge window, on the bridge tab, I push a plus, and creating one bridge with a name, a bridge LAN or something else, you have a tab that is called VLAN on the bridge. And here is a checkbox, VLAN filtering. If you will enable this checkbox, you will enable all the VLAN functionality in this bridge. Otherwise, no, by default is unchecked, so the bridge will not consider any VLAN tags and cannot modify any VLAN packets. After enabled our bridge to check about the VLANs, we have on the bridge menu the VLANs tab. And from here, we can manage and create our VLANs under the bridge. How? This is creating our VLAN. It's a bridge VLAN. Here is the list. I have to repeat, is the list, because you can specify with this down black arrow how many VLANs IDs that you wish. And then the ports, tagged ports, untagged ports, using the common names in the world. And here, with our magic black down arrows, you can add all the interfaces that will participate in these VLANs, the tagged one and the untagged ones. Then we have, in other settings, into the bridge port. Into the bridge port, we have the VLAN tab. What does it mean? Here, we can set up the port VLAN ID or PVID that specify which VLAN the untagged ingress traffic is assigned to. It's useful to create hybrid or access port. And then you have the ingress filtering. It's a checkbox there that will check if the ingress port is a member of the receive VLAN ID into the bridge VLAN table that we created before. And then the tag stacking that will force all packets to be treated as untagged packets. Packets on the ingress port will be tagged with another VLAN tag, regardless if a VLAN tag already exists. The packets with VLAN will be tagged with a VLAN ID that match the PVID value. But as I told you before, the bridge can be hardware or software. How we can know that, or how we can set up that? These are my statements. A bridge can be hardware if the device have a switch chip on board. The ports have HW to yes, that I will show you in the next slide. And we are using a bridge function that is supported by that switch chip. If all the above conditions are satisfied, then the CPU will not be used for this task. And this is the magic, the hardware offloading. If you want to use the hardware things, you have to set up the hardware offload into the port, but the trick is that, and I add zoom for you, on the status bar of a bridge port, on the right bottom corner, when it's hardware, you have this statement, hardware offload. This one is hardware, so it is using the switch chip and not the CPU. If you will try to use some configs on a wrong hardware or using settings that is not allowed by the function supported by the switch chip, this magic word will disappear and will not dark anymore. From this one, you can know that. And this is a small table that you will find on the wiki, where by the chip model, you can see the function that they have, the switch, the bridge, and the VLAN filtering. Look at that. The bridge VLAN filtering, it is actually supported by only one CRS300 series. So all the MikroTik switches of the 300 series support on the bridge the VLAN filtering as I showed you before, and will be hardware because they are a switch product. So the VLANs in the bridge, as I showed you in the previous table, are currently supported only this series, and they support the bridge and the VLAN filtering with the hardware offload at the same time. Using the bridge, you can create almost any kind of port with the VLANs, useful to manage VLANs like in a switch and like in a bridge also. The pro are that they are very flexible configs, but will use the CPU or not, depending the hardware and depending the settings that you made. The cons, they will use the CPU or not, depending the hardware and the settings that you made. It's almost the same statement, you know? So check the specification before you buy your product. Are you now looking for some practical example about the VLANs? On the wiki, you will find all the example in these three kind of flavors, hoping that now you know the differences between them. And the trick is that I hope you enjoy my presentation, that you learn differences about the VLANs in RouterOS, plan your setup using the right hardware, and please don't make a mess with the VLANs. So, see you in Riga if you can, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Any questions?
Yeah, so we have a CCR 1072 and ran into a problem with the MAC address of the VLANs. And so what we had to do was add a MAC address to the bridge and then bridge the VLAN to the MAC address or to that particular bridge. Otherwise, we couldn't see the router because we couldn't get an ARP.
Yes, the CCR is not a switch.
Yep.
It is a router, does not have switch chip inside. So if you want to move layer 2 traffic between the ports, you have to use a software bridge. And with no other choice.
Yeah, but if you just do like a VLAN
and you have, it's a very good idea to specify, to set up in any bridge, any software bridge. Remember that it's very suggested to specify the admin MAC address.
Yep.
Or the MAC address maybe can change. The MAC address, if not specified into the admin MAC on the bridge, will be taken from the first port that is up from Ethernet 1 to Ethernet something. The first one is up, will take this MAC address and use it as an admin MAC address. If you unplug one day this port, maybe the bridge in the past will change and will switch MAC address. So the idea is...
Yeah, so the problem we ran into was that we were just doing VLAN interfaces on the, or VLANs on the interface first. And then we kept getting the same MAC address, even though we tried to have a IP address bound, and we wouldn't be able to ping the gateway, right? So to get around that, we had to create a bridge and then bridge the
VLANs. The VLANs from interfaces VLAN, tagging or untagging the bridge one.
Yeah.
Not the Ethernet one.
Yep.
Thank you.
This may be outside of the scope of your presentation, but we use Q&Q VLANs, and I didn't see anywhere. I noticed on the hardware side you could change the tag, but is the software side the only place that you could do Q&Q?
Yeah, you can do on the software. On the VLAN software, you can do Q&Q. It's supported by RouterOS. Totally supported. It's not supported maybe by Ubiquiti switch.
Okay, that's what I understood.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yep.
Lorenzo, what's a VLAN? Small joke, sorry guys.
Yeah. It's a game. No more question?
Yes, one more.
I know when I was looking at multiple bridges before, it seemed like there was a limitation where you could only have the hardware filtering on one bridge. Are you aware of any configuration where you could actually have like 2 bridges both with VLAN 1 in hardware?
The 2 bridges configuration should be supported by specific switch chip and is not in the CRS300. The CRS300 support only 1 bridge as hardware. But there is a way, if you want to make 2 bridges, you can choose the one that should be hardware and the other not. That's it. Nice question.
Anyone else?
Okay.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you.